You are listening to AP Taylor Swift, the podcast for Swifties who are all about the lyrics. We're your hosts. I'm Jen.
I'm Monty.
And I'm Jody.
And we are your unofficial professors of Taylor Swift.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of AP Taylor Swift. Today we have a show and tell episode for you on the circus, because when we did our Mirror Ball episode, we were going through those lyrics and said, oh, there's a circus in that. We should do a circus episode. And so here we are doing a circus episode. Spoiler alert, we're not going to be talking about Mirror Ball. We found other songs to talk about Taylor Swift in the context of the circus, but honorable mention early on to Mirror Ball, which was the inspiration. Monty, you want to tell us a little bit about the history of the circus before we get started?
So the circus is an interesting topic because it shows up a lot in literature, in film, and music, and has been a part of culture for a few hundred years at this point, at least the way that we think about it today. We were talking before the show, and actually none of us have really specialized in circuses or know a ton about it. So this is coming a little bit from some research beforehand. A few things to keep in mind with regards to circus. First of all, I was really interested in where the term circus comes from, and it can be traced to Latin and Greek. Actually, there's a word kurkos that means ring. It really means circle. There's no coincidence that they start with the same kind of prefix at the beginning of the word, same root, and Kirkos does mean circle or ring. And so when we think of the ring circle or the rings that you see in the way that we think of circuses today, there's always a ringmaster. They come in tents. It's a traveling kind of show. That's kind of the origins of the word. To give a little brief history, the circus as we know it today does date back to the 18th century. There was a man named Philip Astley, who was an English cavalry officer, who pioneered the circular ring format. It was originally intended for equestrian performances. Horses, of course, were big rock stars back in the 1800s, I think, all around. And the term circus was then actually popularized by a Charles Dibdin and a Charles Hughes. I think it's funny that it's Charles and Charles. And they opened the Royal Circus in London in 1782.
To be fair, the Brits had like 5 names for men and 5 names for women for like 200 years.
That's true. That's true. And then by the 19th, 20th centuries, we in the United States are probably really familiar with Barnum and Bailey and the Ringling Brothers. Big names in the circus world that actually lasted well into the 21st century. Even in our lifetimes in the last decade, some of these circuses have gone out of business, but the circus did evolve from being just kind of an animal show where horses are being featured and doing tricks, or lions are doing tricks, to all kinds of performing arts. You could talk magicians, fire breathers, acrobats, tightrope walkers, exotic performances.
Exotic animal performances. I think if we just leave it at exotic performances, that might take us in a different direction.
It's not wrong, though.
Really?
With contortionists and things like that, I think.
Yeah.
Wow.
I read an article that was people were just clutching their pearls about the circus because they wore nude colored outfits, showed a lot of skin, were doing contortionists, doing all these tricks, and that there were things about like, oh, well, we're admiring the human form, but people were like, but this is like very inappropriate.
Moment of vulnerability. You said exotic and I heard erotic, and I was like, ooh, we need to clarify. And those are two different words.
No, but actually, yeah.
There's also very good evidence that forced prostitution was an element of early
we are leaving
circuses.
all of this in then. This is great.
I think today one of the most popular circuses, so to speak, is Cirque du Soleil, which is not the same kind of circus that you would typically think of, but it is all human performers and beautiful costumes, gorgeous. All kinds of storytelling through human dance and acrobatics. So I do think it has clearly evolved, but what we're doing right now is actually making a great transition into the literary purpose of circuses, because in literature, because of this wide range of activities that a circus encompasses, in literature, there have been certain themes that have come out as well. So a lot of times when you think of themes around a spectacle or the performance, that's something that I'm going to be talking about in my song, that can be attributed to a circus because there's this idea of being in a ring, being in a spotlight, putting on a show for purposes of entertainment. But there is also other themes like othering. There's this element of people who were freaks were put on display at the circus. The circus was a freak show, and it was a place for people who felt left out or didn't fit in anywhere else. When there was nowhere else to fit into society, then the circus could take you up and you could travel from place to place and kind of be a nomad. So there's this real element of, for the people who didn't fit into society or into a community, they could join a traveling circus that went around from place to place, or be a part of this community that accepted all kinds of people and creatures, even if they did not fit in anywhere. There's things like the sad clown trope, performers having to put on a joyful face even though they're really, really sad and depressed inside. And that kind of goes back to the idea of putting on a performance. Some ideas around escapism versus reality. This is, again, like, you're not fitting in. The real world isn't for you. And so you are able to get away somewhere where the appearances maybe don't matter as much, or there's more excitement, and you can escape to a more fantasy kind of world. And then the final theme could be related to the ringleader itself, because there's a power structure in circuses, because animals have to do whatever the ringleader wants them to do. The ringmaster can literally order them around, and they're the ones kind of commanding the entire circus. So these are some of the themes that show up. I think we'll talk about specific books and movies and songs maybe as we go through it.
Yeah, I just want to, before we dive in, the only thing I do want to bring up, because I know we mentioned that we are not experts on the circus, but there is a great podcast called Circus Stories with Callie and Mark. And Callie comes from a circus family. And so she goes through the history of the circus, different elements of the circus, and has a lot of she has personal experience as well as other experts on the podcast. So if you are looking to hear from people who have more deeply personal experience, definitely recommend checking out that podcast, and we'll put the link in our show notes.
The only other thing I'll say too, because I think for the most part, circus is going to be a very complicated thing, but we are three not Black women going to be talking about a white woman and the history of slavery, and the circus is a very real thing. I will link in the show notes an article from the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. It's a short article, but they just briefly go into a couple of examples of, like, hey, some really bad things happened, and explain a couple of things. So I'll link that there. I think that's a very important part of the history I don't want to ignore, but I also acknowledge that we are not the group that can speak to that very well. So I'll link to a resource that is from a reliable place that can speak to that, because we are not erasing that history, so we will be linking to learn more about it because it is important.
Yeah, and I think it'll come up, but we're really looking at the different metaphors that the circus brings up and how those are used. But yes, that those metaphors all have their roots and their history in something very real.
And I guess it's worth just explicitly calling out that, Jody, you mentioned that we brought up, the circus came up when we were talking about Mirrorball, but the reason that we felt it would be a great idea to cover is because Taylor Swift uses circus all the time in her music, turns out. And it's probably not a coincidence that it has to do with performance.
Right.
She, of course, is an entertainer. And so I'm really excited to unpack these songs and just see how she kind of translates her own performance experiences and her own occupation to some degree to this metaphor that has long been associated with entertainment.
But interestingly, because the reason we were all like, yeah, this circus makes so much sense, in the Red Tour, she embodied a ringmaster. I couldn't really find any circus references in the lyrics themselves within Red, even stretching it beyond just, I wasn't just looking for the word circus. So I thought that was very interesting that she used the circus metaphor visually in the Red Tour and in the Red era. However, it didn't show up as much in her lyrics.
I think it speaks to maybe how she was feeling in that moment in her career, which is really interesting.
Well, with that, let's dive right in.
Yeah, so I'm going first. In a weird way, arguably I should maybe be going second, but vault tracks are confusing. So I'm doing Say Don't Go from 1989, Taylor's version. So of course, 1989, the original came out much earlier, but in 2023, we got the Taylor's version, which is when we got the vault tracks, which is when we got Say Don't Go. It was written by Diane Warren and, of course, Taylor Allison Swift. This is one of my favorite songs, and I will say right now, we are deep diving this, so I'm going to really focus on just the circusy performance elements. And I do think even those will have different ways we can get into it in the deep dive. So as always with our deep dives, I'm going to hit on some things. I know I'm not going to cover it all. That's intentional. Tune back in next week. So there are 3 things I really wanted to pull out from this song. So I'll kind of go through those really quickly because I do think that they all have circus elements. So we start out right at the beginning. We're shot in the darkest dark. Oh no, I'm unarmed. So one of the things that's interesting about circuses, the American circus in particular, is that there was a lot of regional differences. And in the Wild West, the circuses had a lot of sharpshooters. So you think of Annie Oakley as a really good example of that. And sharpshooting was a skill that was a part of those performances. So right off the bat, we get a sort of performance element. We're shot in the darkest dark, which of course has a different metaphor of, we're shot in the dark. This is impossible. It's not going to happen. But with everything else she talks about with sort of these impossible performance elements, making a shot in the darkest dark while being unarmed is a genuinely impossible thing to do. But if you ever go look up some of the stuff that Annie Oakley could do, I mean, she would shoot like over her shoulder where she wasn't looking. Like she would do these insane things that felt impossible, but she somehow pulled them off. So we're starting out the song with this idea of like, we are an impossible shot, but like, is it impossible? It's like that question I think is kind of in there. And then we get to the next one that is a very straightforward circus reference. I'm standing on a tightrope alone. Tightrope is an insanely difficult thing to do. I have not tried it. I have been taking silks classes at Cirque Indy. So I've been doing the you wrap yourself around in the silk and flip upside down and stuff.
It's so fun, but so hard.
Oh, it's so hard. It's like I've done 3 classes and I can do 2 things. And I'm very proud of those 2 things.
I did it years ago, but I didn't realize that you're supposed to use your legs more than your arms, but I wasn't doing that. So then for 3 days, I couldn't lift my arms past my shoulders.
Every part of my body was sore for 5 days after my first class.
It's like doing TRX classes on steroids.
It's super fun,
a form
though.
of exercise. That looks pretty.
Yeah, I'm not when I do it, but that's gay. So even that, I'm in this entry-level class, I'm doing this, and I was thinking about this with this idea of a tightrope of I'm struggling. And you take the idea of a tightrope, and of course you have the circus imagery of it, where it's this tightrope, it's high, you've got the bar, you've got an umbrella, you've got something else. But I was also thinking of, because this is a song that is so clearly set in a city, it feels like to me that people have done tightropes from skyscrapers to other skyscrapers. So that was the image in my mind, which is still a circus thing. It was almost always circus performers, acrobats who were doing these stunts to promote their other performances. So it's still related, but it's an insanely difficult thing to do. The idea of being on a tightrope alone, so you're doing this insane performance, but no one's around, is a really sad thing. You're destroying your feet, your body, and all of this for kind of nothing, it feels like. And just an interesting fact that I learned is that these types of balancing acts is one of the oldest known performances. So back in 250 BC in Egypt, there's evidence of balancing act performers in Egypt. So one of the earliest documented examples of a performance is this balancing act. And of course, we can maybe get into this episode. We'll get into it next week if we don't. This idea of a balancing act is a really potent metaphor for what else is going on in this song. So it's a performance, but it has other things going on as well. And then the other one I wanted to call out is that I'm trying to see the cards you won't show. I'm about to fold unless you say don't go. This one's a bit of a stretch, and I want to acknowledge that, but I also saw a lot of evidence that a lot of the sideshows had magicians and card tricks, and of course, I'm folding, that's more of a poker thing, but some of the sideshows would be sort of interactive, so again, a little bit of a stretch. Is this a direct circus reference? Maybe not, but it's still a performance thing, it's still a skill thing, there's still an audience that you're trying to when you're performing, I say as if I've performed a lot, you're feeding off from the audience. And in this metaphor, it's kind of down to 2 people of trying to read your audience. Are they going to fold? Am I not going to fold? How do I do this? How do I navigate this? Again, a calculated risk, which is, I think, the metaphor for that one. So I know it's a stretch, but those are the 3 things I wanted to point out. And there's some other things we can talk about with that. But definitely performance elements, incredible skill is required. And these are 3 wildly different skills that she's calling on for this song, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, I think there's always definitely illusion kind of elements to
Hmm.
circus. I think it's valid to say it's not specifically card tricks, but also the thing that came to my mind was like Vegas as a circus. Like, like if you think of that whole concept, I mean, I know there's a circus part of Vegas, but just this idea of like the adult entertainment world. Vegas has magic trick shows. There's a ton of
It's a spectacle.
actual circus shows. All the Cirque du Soleil things are there, and of course the casinos are there because you're there for gambling. The whole thing is a spectacle, and yeah, in that sense, there's definitely a thread that ties everything together.
Yeah, and I mean those illusion acts, those magician acts were sideshows for the circus, and
Exactly.
sideshows were a uniquely American circus thing. You didn't really find it anywhere else, which I thought was also just, I don't know, very American of how can we squeeze another dollar out of this
Yeah,
show? Let's
more
have some, yeah,
capitalism
exactly.
opportunities.
The other thing I love about this is the metaphor of the tightrope. There's so much risk and vulnerability in walking on a tightrope, and it is just you. There are no strings. Maybe there's a net underneath you, but I feel like in a lot of circuses there probably wasn't for a really long time. And I love just using that as a metaphor for this what the speaker is feeling in this relationship.
And the fact that it's on 1989. I'm excited to deep dive this because I think there's also something there to just being that city album with a lot of
Well,
building
yeah.
imagery. Yeah.
Philippe Petit walked between the Twin Towers in New York City on August 7th, 1974. Fun fact, Jake Gyllenhaal narrated the animated short film The Man Who Walked Between the Towers.
That is a
Little,
fun fact.
little Taylor Swift connection there.
I think one thing that you also brought up, Jen, that is worth touching on is you brought up the ancient Egypt reference. And when we were going over our history of circus, I think we really focused on the modern circus as we know it, as going back to the 18th century. But actually, one thing that was so interesting that I thought was that there are references to this kind of spectacle going back to ancient Egypt and a lot of Hebrew writings about circuses. Apparently, there was actually a whole list of resources that I got from one of my resources that was just Hebrew publications of mentions of what could be considered earlier versions of circuses. So it's really interesting, even just how the concept has definitely been around for a very long time. It's just maybe evolved into the present form that we know today.
Yeah, I also feel like, people complain about kids on YouTube these days, and it's like, hey, if someone can do weird shit, people have wanted to watch that since
Forever.
humanity started.
Yeah.
Like, that's just like a core part of human nature.
Everyone loves a freak show.
YouTube's now the modern circus.
The other thing I wanted to talk about, and we briefly got into this in the intro, is the idea of the othering in circuses. And there's two sides to it. In one way, the circus could be a welcoming place for the quote unquote others, the people who are the outcasts, the freaks who don't fit in. But then on the other hand, and I don't think the second one is what Taylor's getting to here, or it doesn't really apply in this context, but there was also a forced nature of it. So P.T. Barnum, sorry to hurt the Greatest Showman a little bit, but he would purchase enslaved folks and have them perform. He kidnapped children and made them perform. So there was a forced element to this too, sometimes, of like, sure, it's a freak show, some people find home there, but sometimes you're forced into it too. But I think that the othering of it, I just want to acknowledge both sides because it can be welcoming, but like history is real.
Yeah, and I think they especially like children trafficking was a big thing that kids who got lost would end up in the circus because they could earn money that way and earn a living, and they were completely at the mercy of whoever was in charge.
Yeah, I was gonna say the darkest version, but I think the darkest fictional version that I've seen is in the Phantom of the Opera film. The Phantom has this disfigured half of his face, and in the film version of it with Gerard Butler, as a child, they showed the flashback to him a child, and it's just very intense because it's film, so you see it all close up. And he was in a cage and has like a sack on his head, and people pay like 25 cents, whatever the French version of it was at the time, pay a coin to go see the freak of nature. And he was raised in this cage with like one toy. And yes, it's sort of dramatized, but I don't think it's that dramatized. Like it was pretty harsh. And if you kind of looked like a not normal person, then you would be kind of shoved into this corner. But the reason I bring that up is I think in this song, and I'm interested when we deep dive this to see how well this holds out, I think these references of we're a shot in the darkest dark, I'm trying to see the cards, I'm just standing on this tightrope alone, is this alienation from the protagonist where they feel alienated from what's happening around them. Like when you're on a tightrope, you're not in the audience, you're on the tightrope. When you're shooting in the dark, you have no sense of what's happening around you. When someone's holding cards in front of you and you're trying to decide, like there's something about that othering that I think does play a role in this song of she feels very separated from the you, and these metaphors, these moments dive into that feeling of their separation. I'm different, or we're too different, and maybe that can't be overcome, but I want to overcome it. We'll get more into it in the deep dive, but I think the natural othering of circus performers does do something here.
Othering, or maybe even more specifically, the victim of voyeurism to some capacity, right?
Yeah.
Like it's kind of a voyeuristic relationship where you have somebody who is the freak and is the object of other people's fascination, and then you have all these other people who are just staring in at the chaos and the mess and getting some sort of pleasure from that.
Which we'll get into in my song, which is not next.
So we don't explicitly get into that in my song, but I'm going to go next. And my song does very much deal with the performative characteristics of a circus. So we can talk through it and let's see if we kind of get to the voyeurism. But I did So It Goes. It's from Reputation. At this moment in time, guys, we still do not have Rep TV, I just want to say. So this song came out in 2017, and it was written by Taylor Swift, Max Martin, Oscar Gores, Johann Carl Schuster, a powerful team that we always list whenever we talk about Reputation. And this song is very, I think, much more like of all of her songs, I think one of the most obviously circus-y ones. The metaphor is pretty ingrained, although I will say there's maybe more focus on the illusion aspect of a circus than maybe the acrobatic aspects. First off, really interesting. It does start off with See You in the Dark. So Jen, when you were talking about the dark, the shot in the dark, I immediately was like, cool, she likes dark circuses, because this song also starts off in the dark. And
so the Night Circus is the perfect comparison novel.
Yes, it absolutely is.
We talked about this in our novel episode. All eyes on you, my magician. This idea that there is somebody in the dark, in the center, all eyes are on that person. I'm going to assume that person's in a spotlight, although it doesn't actually say that explicitly here. All eyes on us. Then she just puts herself in that song and then says, you make everyone disappear. That's an illusion. She says, you cut me into pieces. That's an illusion. Gold cage, hostage to my feeling, back against the wall. I'm thinking of that trick where people maybe throw knives at somebody who's against a wall, perhaps tripping when you're gone. All of these things are illusions. And throughout the song, we actually keep seeing references to illusions. At one point, she says, all eyes on me, you're illusionist, and talks about making all your gray days clear, wear you like a necklace. And then, of course, the main chorus of the song is So It Goes. So It Goes is a phrase that I always think of. Slaughterhouse-Five. Kurt Vonnegut there's a story is about Billy Pilgrim and an alien, and it's a really weird story and really hard to summarize. But one of the lines that keeps coming up throughout the novel is So It Goes. And you realize that it's because you're listening to an unreliable narrator who is actually a victim of severe PTSD from the time in World War II.
I've never read it. Shockingly.
Oh my gosh, you have got to read this book. It's probably one of my all-time favorites.
He's the pride and joy of Indiana. You can claim like 4 famous people, and he's one of them. Orville Redenbacher.
I was going to say there's got to be
the
popcorn.
You know, somebody asked Jon Stewart what book he was reading, and he recommended just Kurt Vonnegut. Just read any Kurt Vonnegut is like his one thing. I love him. I love this particular book, but yeah, I associate So It Goes. It's a very famous phrase with that book. And I think the key in that book and here in this song is that you might have an unreliable narrator or you don't know what's going on. Things are not as they seem. When somebody says, so it goes, you're adding a caveat, so to speak, and saying, or so they say, or that's what I've heard. And by in doing so, you're suddenly taking away the need for accuracy or the need for validity. You just said something like, you cut me into pieces, or I feel this way. And then by saying so it goes, you just kind of contradict that and saying, but it could be wrong. Who knows? And that's kind of what I get out of the song. And so how this ties to circus is, of course, the performance, performative aspect of a circus, where everything that you see is for entertainment. It can be big, bold colors, over the top, extravagant, but it's not always what it seems. There's a different side of it. Maybe the amazing performers that you see are slaves or victims of being sold into the system. Maybe the ringmaster, so glorious in the center, is actually abusive. I don't know. But just that there is this other element and things that you may not see. In the fact that they think of themselves as illusionists in this song is really interesting. We're not deep diving this one, but at some point I think that would just
we need to.
It raises an interesting question of just, what does that really mean? If the two people who are the objects of the song call themselves illusionists, and they know that they're putting on tricks and they're putting on a show.
We definitely need to deep dive this song, because you just kind of brought it in. I don't know that I ever really understood this song, and you definitely brought it in with a lens that I am now like, wait a second, what's happening here? I love it.
I know. We decided to deep dive Say Don't Go because we all really
love the
Say
song.
Don't Go.
It's okay. We'll get to
We'll
So
come
It
back to
Goes.
it.
We will come back to it. But I like the different elements of circuses that we're already seeing between the two songs, right? Tightropes and that performative voyeuristic element, and then here in this song, magic and illusion and everything not being what it seems. And I think you're also you're making connections not just to the performances, but also how a circus operates in general, that it is not what it seems.
This one could be even more as like a ringleader perspective. It's people who are very much in control of what they're doing. You're getting some visibility into the fact that the person putting on the show knows they're putting on a show.
Right.
And they are doing so intentionally.
Well, and I think there's an element too where if you go to a magic show or an illusion show, you know you're about to be lied to, but that's why you're going. You're going along for the ride of being tricked and being fooled in a way that entertains you. And I think there could be something someday when we deep dive this to unpack that a little bit more. But I'm thinking of the lines of all eyes on me, you're illusionist, all eyes on us. I make all your gray days clear, which is obviously a metaphor, but when you're aligning that with an illusionist, that's like the idea that there's an illusionist who's changing the weather is a very powerful illusionist, but it's still an illusion. Like it's like you kind of go back and forth of, well, it's an illusion, but it's a really cool one, but is it really real? But does it really matter if it's real? Well, I don't want anything that's fake, but like, is anything really real at the end of the day? Like, I think it gives you this ping pong sense of what's real and doesn't matter if it's real, if I'm enjoying it, because a magician has tricks up their sleeve, but you love it. Like knowing how it works kind of ruins it.
Totally
sometimes.
ruins it.
I'm thinking of Christopher Nolan's Prestige, the famous opening and closing lines where they're like, "Are you watching closely?" And then they're like, "You don't really want to know, do you?"
And to use that in a song about love is fascinating.
Oof. All right. Well,
that hurt Jody.
When are we deep diving this one?
I think we should do an unreliable narrator episode and then bring it back.
I would love that. Okay, we're bringing it back. Well, I have the last song. I also have the song that we've already deep dived. I'm talking about Who's Afraid of Little Old Me from Tortured Poets Department. Came out in 2024. This is track 10, written by Taylor Swift. We previously discussed this song on our Witches episode, episode 60, as well as in a deep dive, episode 61, and we will link those in the show notes. There's a very direct circus reference. She says, I was tame, I was gentle, till the circus life made me mean. Don't you worry, folks, we took out all her teeth. So she is directly referencing the circus. This song and this line in particular, when I thought about it through the lens of the circus, made me think a lot about the book Water for Elephants by Sara Gruen. I think that's how you pronounce her name. It was also adapted into a movie starring Reese Witherspoon, and then also a Broadway musical, which I saw on Broadway last year. The musical was fabulous. I hope it goes on some sort of national tour because it was just a really beautiful way to have that story come to life. But the book came out in 2006, so I am going to spoil it. So if you haven't read it, just fast forward. But in the book, the narrator, Jacob, tells the story of how he cared for the animals in the circus. He had particular fondness for Rosie the elephant, who was just this very talented, docile, but very sweet elephant. Rosie was abused by August, who I thought he was the ringleader, but Wikipedia says he was the equestrian director, going back to equestrian and horses being very big in the circus. August
Wait,
was
I have a fun fact about that.
okay. Would you like to
So
tell it now, or should I finish?
it's about the. I think I might be proving you were correct.
Great,
So the reason.
perfect. Then keep going.
So the ringmaster originally. So when the equestrian shows were the central part of it, the acrobats would be on the horses, jumping up and doing tricks, and the ringmaster's job was to keep the horses moving in the right place. And so that was the only job, but it eventually became the MC. It eventually became the one running the show, but that's why they still wear equestrian style clothing as the ringmaster. It's because they were originally the equestrian.
Thank you. Okay,
person.
So same.
So was Red Taylor an equestrian
she
or
was
a ringleader?
Both. They're the same thing.
Yes, and that's the same thing.
Amazing. So August was the equestrian director / ringmaster of the circus, and throughout the story, he abuses Rosie physically. Rosie's the elephant. He probably abuses some of the people physically as well, but he definitely mentally and emotionally abuses other people. And then, spoiler alert, at the climax of the book, Rosie the elephant kills August to protect Jacob and the others who August abused. So you have
Good for her.
Yeah, exactly. But here you go. She was this tame, docile, talented, loving elephant who was abused by this guy, and she was tame, she was gentle till the circus life made her mean, and then she killed him. So in this song, among other metaphors, right, in our witches episode, we talked about witches, obviously, but Taylor's using the circus as a metaphor for exploitation, for control, for the inhumane treatment. She's using the circus as a metaphor for constantly being watched and judged and looked at for the entertainment of others. And so she's directly comparing her life as a musician, as an entertainer, or perhaps the life of being a woman in the world to being in a circus, being controlled, being exploited. The other line and we've talked about cages in some of the other songs. You caged me, then you called me crazy. I am what I am because you trained me. And I think that, again, we talked about the reason possibly that Taylor uses the circus very often is it's a form of entertainment and spectacle, much like what her life has turned into. But I think this song in particular and the way she's using the circus expands the metaphor beyond just being a metaphor for an entertainer's life and really just feels like a metaphor for the female experience, which is what we talked about in our deep dive. This idea of being told how to act, what to do, women dressing for the male gaze, showing up at work and being told, you're to this, you're to that, this is what you need to do to conform, to be appropriate, and that really being frustrating, constantly being judged and exploited and controlled. There's a limit to how much you can really take as a person. So I just think that the circus here, it's not the first visual that I get. I think probably because of the way the song was performed in the Eras tour was much more witchy vibes. I always think of Mrs. Havisham when I think of this song and this performance, but I think the use of the circus directly in the lyrics really, to me, harkens back to the animals in the circus, and because those are the ones who were like the most exploited and abused and caged.
I think there's something really special about the fact that this song is about a woman and you're hearing the circus reference about the animals and thinking about water for elephants specifically because in the history of the circus, we've talked about how it was quite an abusive environment for humans
Yes.
in the beginning. And at some point along the way, that was banned to some degree. And there were guidelines put in place around the people in the circus. But the animal abuse continues well into modern times. And Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey went out of business a few years ago, largely because of the protests around the animal abuse. And the fact that people over time did realize that animal abuse and human abuse is linked. People who are animal abusers tend to be human abusers. And just because it's not a human does not mean that you can get away with abusing it. The fact that we did eventually get there as a society, maybe not everybody, but most people have gotten there as a society, is important. And the fact that for a long time people didn't realize it and this continued to show in the history of circus, I think is really important and definitely part of the way that it gets referenced in literature. And she plays with this idea a lot also, I think, because as a performer, especially as a performer who started as a child,
right?
I think there's a lot of attention being drawn to the idea that child actors and child performers can be abused as well through this process.
Yeah, I mean, it even, to get real feminist history about it, takes me even back to Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, the idea that women are people. Women are not treated as people. They're the second sex. They're a separate thing. The othering, the animalism, all of that does kind of wrap up together. But I think it even, abuse and taking advantage of the animals goes back to the second line of the song. My bare hands paved their paths. The idea that by abusing these animals, people got really rich. I've been to the Ringling Brothers Museum and Estate in Sarasota, which is where they spent most of their winters. And I remember it was a really conflicting time because on one hand, it's a beautiful museum and plot of lands that's like protected now, which is cool. But the museum does acknowledge, like, hey, so some of this isn't great. And so you're like, okay, cool. But then you go and you see their mansion and you see their art collection. And it's like they made so much money. So much money. And they treated the people horribly, for sure. The Ringling Brothers maybe were like a slight step up than some others from what I saw, but like bad stuff still happened. But the animal abuse for sure was there, and the animals were getting nothing out of it. Like there wasn't even like a community that you could argue was happening. It was these animals were taken out of their homes, forced into a lifestyle they were not made for, and people got rich off of it. And it's like, yeah, my bare hands paved their paths. Like, yeah, okay, that metaphor completely lines up.
And there often wasn't even a show without the animals, right? People were coming to see elephants and lions and tigers and bears, oh my. And if an animal was sick or whatever, or injured, I mean, A, many shows would make them perform, but B, if the animal wasn't there, they would have to cancel the show because that's what people were coming for. And so the exploitation of these animals who are that is what people are coming for.
Yeah, and I think it's such a powerful metaphor also because it's a difficult thing to talk about because the spectators have such positive associations and memories of this. I think especially within a certain generation, there were people who grew up going to the circuses and they were truly spectacular, life-changing, core memory kinds of experiences. You go as a kid and you just feel like, wow, I've stepped into this world of magic and wonder where elephants can dance and people can walk in the sky on these thin tightropes. And I mean, there is that element of it of just being really wondrous. And I remember watching like a Mickey Mouse circus videotape that I had growing up. It was just like all of the Mickey Mouse characters at the circus. And it was incredible. It was so cool. And people don't want to taint those positive memories with the knowledge and acceptance of the fact that there was so much abuse and darkness that was behind there. I think the way that it gets brought up in Taylor's music, in this song especially, it's drawing attention to something that all of us as fans really enjoy and associate with positive memories. And yet she feels the need to pull the curtain back on that a little bit and reveal just how crazy of a process it's been for her. It made her mad, or it makes the subject of the song crazy because of the circus that they're raised in. I think there's something like really interesting there about using this as a metaphor, because it's not easy to talk to. It's like things that people want to be all positive and butterflies and amazing, and then you have to acknowledge that there might be a darkness behind it as well.
I didn't like the circus as a kid, and I am just now realizing that it might be because of Dumbo. Wasn't that like a scary circus?
Yeah. I never saw it. My
You
mom
never.
banned me from watching movies with animals because I would become so inconsolable. I had to be taken out of a movie theater once because I was crying so hard about
Oh,
an
I made
animal.
my grandmother take me out of All Dogs Go to Heaven, because
Yeah.
why would you
Yeah.
make a movie about dogs dying for
Yeah.
children? Like,
So
that's just not okay.
I think our generation is one of the first that
Yeah.
maybe
Like,
grew up
yeah.
with PETA being a very strong force, or just a lot of animal activism. And so, yes, I do think Bambi and Dumbo and a lot of these animal movies early on in our formative years really transformed us. I also agree that when I would go to the circus, it felt weird to see animals doing things that animals are not supposed to do.
The
Yeah.
Big
But
Apple
they're-
Circus is like right here. And I remember going as a kid, probably more than once, but I just don't think it was never something you're talking about. Like, it's a spectacle that people love. I'm like, I don't.
But that's why I specifically said a generation above us. We
Yeah.
also grew up with TVs. I think you have to remember, like, there were people who didn't, and like this was entertainment for
What?
them.
Yeah.
So
I'm sorry,
I'm
what?
definitely
Wait,
thinking
hold
of
the
like
phone.
I'm talking about like my parents' generation and
Yeah.
older folks who in the 50s and 60s
They
this
had
was
TV, but yes.
truly well, not everyone had a TV. Like my parents
Actually,
grew up in a different
recently,
country where
yeah,
they did not have TVs.
there was something like a 400% growth in televisions by 1960 something. I recently
I
looked
mean,
this up.
maybe
Don't ask
that's
why.
also possible, like
But-
in America.
but
Yeah, with all
of-
four
of-
channels that they could access.
Correct. Yes, exactly. It was a
Exactly.
very different. I forgot
And like
why
the
I was
radio
looking this
lasted
up.
for a long time because TV adoption wasn't.
For
I
sure.
mean, it was expensive.
Yeah,
and like you would
no,
have
very
more-
expensive
yeah.
and not as ubiquitous, and 4 channels and mostly for news and not entertainment, and certainly not for children
Exactly.
to the extent that it is now. where
Right.
we
The
have
way
YouTube.
I think, yeah. So just to be clear, I'm not talking about the way that we grew up in our childhood
sure.
experiences, but I think in the 50s and 60s, and maybe even like
I would say earlier, yeah.
earlier as well. But as late as that, like people that we know today grew up with really fond memories
Yeah.
of the circus.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a very broad statement, but I think it's one of those systemic things where it's really hard to reconcile of
Yeah.
this is a system that's really bad and I was complicit and I enjoyed being
Right.
complicit, but now I can look back and say, oh, this is bad and I
Right.
shouldn't have enjoyed that, but I did. And you just have to sit in the uncomfortableness of that and say, okay, well, now moving
Both can
forward,
exist, yes.
yeah, I have learned something and I'm going to adjust my reality accordingly. And you just make your peace with, like, that's just how systemic things are.
Yeah, and nobody likes to admit that they enjoy
No.
the voyeurism though, right? But like that is what voyeurism is
Yeah.
like there are people who enjoy the freak show. And I keep using the word freak show, and I feel like that word itself is a very controversial word because
Yeah.
it makes you uncomfortable. You're not supposed to call people freaks, and you're
Right.
definitely not supposed to look at them, and you're definitely not supposed to get joy out of it. So
And it's the word they used, so that tells you a lot.
that's
Yeah.
exactly. I
Yeah.
think I enjoy it because I think it makes people feel the way that you're supposed to feel. Like,
uncomfortable.
Yeah.
it's supposed to make
Mhm.
you uncomfortable, and it is definitely not a politically correct term because that just shouldn't be allowed.
Yeah.
I think it's just what makes it such an interesting metaphor to
Yeah.
use, because it says so much more about what you're talking about. That this thing that,
Exactly.
like, wait a second, you're enjoying watching this, but should you be enjoying?
Yeah, and so in many ways, circus is a very much nicer, more forgiving term for that. But like, I think the fact that Taylor keeps using it in her music, and there's some themes that we notice between all of our songs today. They all like have something to do with like the dark, and like the cage comes up again and again.
Mhm.
And I just think it's interesting that she makes these parallels as a performer because she did start in this industry at a really young age. And I think there's something there to like people really, especially all of TTPD is like this, like people really love her. The Eras tour was fantastic and people are huge fans, but you peel back the curtain a little bit and you just see what really the toll it maybe takes on them as a performer, and it's interesting to think about.
It was great rebranding by Cirque du Soleil to keep the
huge.
Cirque so you know what's happening, but to not use the word circus.
Yeah,
like,
to not call it a circus.
10 out of 10 branding decision.
Yeah.
You have the reference, but you're saying we're not a circus. We're people doing stuff. There's no animals. It's different.
Yeah.
Like but it's still fun and it's a spectacle.
I was thinking about that. Like, while Ringling Brothers is getting canceled, the fact that Cirque du Soleil has been able to do well because they just didn't have animals and they focused on performers as artists. I think there was some controversy with their performers also, but they were able to work through it. I think it didn't quite take them down the way that it took down some other circuses.
Yeah, I mean, you can work with people to pay them better, to give them better benefits. There's not much you can do for an elephant in Midwest America when it's in no way supposed to be here.
You mean you don't see elephants all the time?
No, I would say I wish. I really love elephants, but again, I'm in the Midwest, so I don't actually wish that. But
shouldn't watch Dumbo then.
Okay, Dumbo is all about like an elephant being separated from its mother. There's like many layers.
I'm not allowed to watch movies with animals.
Yeah.
As a 33-year-old, I will still tell people, "Oh, my mom says I can't watch that movie."
Yeah,
that rule has never expired, and it never will.
Dumbo is like traumatizing beyond belief. I can't believe they made that a child.
I think there's a
movie.
Trigger warning on it on Disney Plus now.
There
Isn't
absolutely should be.
Well, the other thing with circuses is there were a ton of minstrel shows, which that's a whole other history of racism, and I think that's
in the movie. Yeah, there's many warnings on Dumbo for that reason.
The animal stuff was to a point that in second grade they made us watch a movie, and at the end the dog died, and my mom wrote a letter and said, "You cannot let her watch this." Like my mom was like, "I am not dealing with whatever is going to happen as a result of it." And my teacher was like, "I think it'd be good for her," and I was like, "Again,
absolutely
you
not.
need to understand." No,
I think it's incredibly powerful as a tool for adults. I don't think kids should be made to watch it. Like, did you know that the deer population that has increased has been direct result of Bambi?
Good.
Like in America, hunting had gotten so ridiculous that there were actually no deer, and then Bambi came out and people just stopped hunting deer overnight. And like, I grew up in Georgia where we literally had a creek in our backyard, and you could see 10 deer at least every night. Like, I didn't live in the farms. I lived in the suburbs. They're everywhere. There were deer everywhere. And people are like, yeah, deer populations are going up because of Bambi.
Yeah, but then on the other hand, Dalmatian adoptions skyrocketed after 101 Dalmatians, and Dalmatians are not easy dogs to handle. And then like they were returned en masse. So it is wild the power movies have.
Well, that's all we have on circuses. Join us next time when we deep dive Say Don't Go.
That's all we have for you today on AP Taylor Swift. Be sure to rate and review us on your favorite podcast app. Follow us on social at AP Taylor Swift to stay up to date, and join us next time as we overanalyze and deep dive into the next Taylor Swift song on AP Taylor Swift.